Hi, people. Hope you're all well. So, I've started watching a Netflix series, true crime series, Jeffrey Dahmer, or let me give the exact title, Dahmer Monster, the Jeffrey Dahmer story. That sounds sensational. It's actually, from what I've seen so far, it's quite well done. It's not over the top sensationalism by that title. Um, This isn't really about a review of what I've been watching. I'm up to episode three, episode four now, actually. I'm going to watch after this. Um, that's not what it's about. It's more about the general idea of how serial killers specifically are documented, how they are, for want of a better term, well, trying to think of the right term, promoted, featured in popular culture, because this is actually a very significant phenomena. Now, a while back, I made a video on, I think I entitled it "The Mob Films Glorify Crime," and I was discussing how films like Goodfellas, A Bronx Tale, The Godfather, and others focus on this world, this violent world of mafiosos and everything around that. So this one is somewhat similar, although the crime that we're talking about is quite a different phenomena because serial killers tend to operate independently for the most part. Occasionally you have pairs, but it's mostly individuals. Whereas in the mob world, well, there's a few differences. In the mob world, it tends to be um, the mobsters kill each other. This is not to say that innocent people don't also suffer, because they most certainly do, especially in Italy. There have been a lot of innocent people killed in these mob wars. Law enforcement, judges as well. But with serial killers, it's almost universally, specifically targeting um, innocent people, often vulnerable people. So that's a different thing altogether. But in both areas, you have a huge amount of popular culture and a huge amount of material that's out there, films, documentaries, books. Now, here's the thing. When you have a case that's very well known, and I'll be talking about the Jeffrey Dahmer case in this video, is very well documented. It's one. His case was one of the most documented of all American serial killers. I think it's fair to say. Off the top of my head, people think American serial killers. They think certainly Jeffrey Dahmer, Ted Bundy is almost always at the top of the list as well. I'd say Bundy's similar in terms of coverage to Dahmer. I'd say those two are probably at the very top. John Wayne Gacy is pretty high up there. Um, then after that, maybe Gary Ridgway, and then you get some others. But there's many, many, many others that are nowhere near as well known. But I'd say at the very, very top, when we're thinking of American serial killers, it's basically Bundy, Dahmer, and Gacy. Those three probably more than any others. Interesting thing is recently Samuel Little, who died in 2020, may actually be the most prolific killer in American history in terms of proven number of victims. I believe he had 61 victims, which is actually well ahead of Bundy and Dahmer. Yet he's not as well known, even though, because I've heard one theory as to why some are better known than others. Oh, well, it's because of the 24-hour news cycle, and it's because of social media. Well, Samuel Little was apprehended in the age of social media. Samuel Little, his crimes were revealed quite recently, yet he is still not as well known as the others. That's strange. It could be because his crimes took place nationwide, so they weren't concentrated in one city or one state, and they were over a long span of time. We're talking from, they estimate from 1970 to 2005, so we're talking over 3 decades. That may be why his case is not as well documented, because it's not concentrated in one area where there could be a sort of epithet for this killer. In the case of Gary Ridgway, he was known as the Green River Killer. In the case of Dahmer, the Milwaukee Cannibal, and so on. This is obviously a dark subject. Yet, let's be honest, there is huge, huge public fascination with serial killers. The United States seems to have more than its share. If you look at the list on Wikipedia of the world's most prolific serial killers, it's astonishing how many are in the United States. After the US, there's a lot in Russia and the former Soviet Union, and there's quite a lot in South America. But there seems to be an enormous proportion in the United States. There is actually a theory about this, and if I can find the author, let me just quote him. I'm just Googling this as I'm talking. His theory was that after World War II, and he was careful not to talk about, not to sort of stigmatize World War II veterans, but basically his theory was that in World War II you had a lot of broken men come back. I've just found the source now. Several sources actually for this. This from the New York Post. It talks about the title is "Brace for a Surge in Serial Killers in 25 Years." Um, this is from August 2018. Did a broken generation of soldiers returning from World War II spawn America's so-called golden age of serial killers? That's a shocking hypothesis put forth by author Peter Vronsky, whose third book, Sons of Cain, A History of Serial Killers from the Stone Age to the Present, catalogued 17,000 years of homicidal maniacs, from Cain to Jack the Ripper to the Green River Killer. And his idea is that with World War II, you had this sort of generation of young men who were growing up, basically coming of age. They were mostly baby boomers, coming of age in roughly the 1960s to the 1980s. And it is interesting, the number of serial killers whose crime spanned the 70s and the 80s is astonishing. If you look at some of the most prolific cases, Bundy, certainly, John Wayne Gacy, Dahmer was a little bit later, Dean Corll, Juan Corona, all these people, their crimes were mostly in the 70s. And it's true in Britain as well. So there may well be a correlation with that, although the author was careful to reiterate he wasn't stigmatizing World War II veterans. He was just saying that there was a trajectory here where there was, or rather, a correlation between this kind of generation who were the sons of World War II veterans, and they tended to be broken, lost young men. There may be something in that. There may well be something in that. I wouldn't totally dismiss it. Um, but what I want to talk about is, well, there's a few things. Why is it that some cases are better known than others? Because I don't think it could just be put down to the time period, like, you know, uh, certain cases are in the modern era, therefore there's more of a news cycle. I don't think that's necessarily true because, like I said, the Samuel Little case is still not that well known. I mean, it's been documented, there's been lots of news reports on it, but he hasn't yet had the sort of influence in popular culture that the others have. Maybe that will happen in the future, I don't know. I mean, he was a heavyweight boxer, and I understand that he actually knocked out his victims. They were usually homeless young women. Um, in the case of and Bundy, it might well be that their crimes were particularly vicious and particularly gruesome. But arguably all these cases are. Um, But I'm just going to quote another case, and I was thinking, well, this is interesting. This happened at more or less the same time as the Bundy crimes, excuse me, the Dahmer crimes. Yeah, this guy's not as well known, Herb Baumeister. Now, I'll just read out the introduction. Herbert Richard Baumeister was an American businessman and suspected serial killer, a resident of the Indianapolis suburb of Westfield, Indiana. Baumeister was under investigation for murdering over a dozen men in the early 1990s. That's exactly the same time as Dahmer. Most of whom were last seen at gay bars, again, the same victims. Police found the remains of 11 people, eight identified at Baumeister's property. Baumeister committed suicide after a warrant was issued for his arrest. He was later linked to a series of murders of at least 12 men along Interstate 70, which occurred in the early to mid 1980s. Now, this guy, we're talking possibly over 20 homicides, yet he isn't a household name in anywhere near the same way that Dahmer is. So, why is that? I mean, the crimes are very similar. The victims are of a similar demographic, time period, even a similar location. The Midwest. So strange. It may be because Dahmer was actually convicted of his crimes, whereas this guy, it was never proven but strongly suspected. So that could be a factor. But you look at the Dahmer and Bundy cases, the sheer number of films and documentaries that have been made on them arguably transcends the proportion of what they were convicted of. The interesting thing is, even in the United States, there are more prolific killers. I'm just going to read from Wikipedia here. If you just bear with me a second. And in a minute, I'm going to get into the issue of what is in good taste, what is exploitation, and so on. Because I think it's a very interesting subject. There's a lot of angles to look at with this. Here in the UK, ITV and Channel 4, I think it's mostly ITV, have pretty much done a drama documentary or a dramatization of every high-profile serial killer in modern British history. I mean, I could think of one for Dennis Nilsen, who was often called Britain's Dahmer. Fred and Rosemary West, the Moors murders. That, of course, got more attention recently because of the claims that little Keith Bennett's remains had been found. That was a false lead, unfortunately. Um, the Yorkshire Ripper, all these really high profile cases. There was a dramatization on pretty much all of them. Um, and there has been debate in this country over whether it's exploitation or not. This is serial killers by numbers of victims. Now, interestingly, they have a whole category um, on killers who were involved in the medical profession because it seems to be a big proportion in that area. Again, that attracts a different sort of attention because it's not bloody in the same way. It tends to be overdoses. It tends to be, in fact, here in Britain, we've had a case which is just starting to emerge, and even now it's not that high profile. Lucy Letby, she's a nurse who, and I should be careful what I say here because she hasn't been convicted yet, but she's a nurse who's been accused of killing babies at I believe it's called the Duchess of Cheshire Hospital in Chester. Um, but at least eight babies have died under her watch. I should say this is an ongoing case. She has not been convicted, so I want to be very careful and clear about that. But if she is guilty, if it does transpire that she is guilty of the crimes to which she is accused, she will rank as one of Britain's most prolific in terms of numbers of victims, at least eight babies and possibly more. But looking at the list, um, Luis Garavito proven 193 victims between 1992 and 1999. This was in Colombia, Ecuador, and Venezuela. Pedro Lopez, 1969 to 1980, 110 victims. Javid Iqbal, Pakistan, 100 victims, 1998 to 1999. Mikhail Popkov, Russia, 1992 to 2010, 78. And the top list is all like that. But looking at the top American killers, Samuel Little, 60 proven victims up to 93 between 1970 and 2005. Gary Ridgway, 1982 to 2049 victims. That's the Green River Killer. Then Ted Bundy, 35 proven victims, 1974 to 1978. Clementine Barnaba, an African American woman, 1911, 35 victims. She's not that well documented. Then we have John Wayne Gacy, 33 victims, 1972 to 1978. I'm just talking about the top American killers here. Juan Corona, 25 victims, between, throughout 1971. These were often labor men from Mexico, drifters. Interestingly, the top British killer that is cited here, outside of Harold Shipman, he's at the very, very top of the list, but that's kind of a different sort of murder. They were overdoses. There was a documentary done on that, or rather a dramatization done on Chipman's crimes. But actually, the very top of the list of British serial killers, outside of Harold Shipman, is Bruce George Peter Lee. Now, I guarantee you, most people in Britain probably haven't heard of this guy, but he was an epileptic arsonist, a young offender who killed people around the city of Hull. Now, his crimes took place at the same time as the Yorkshire Ripper. That could be a reason why he's not well documented. Between 1973 and 1979, 26 victims. 26 victims. That makes him, you know, worse than Nelson and Sutcliffe combined. Yet he's not as well documented. Um, there's other cases. Patrick Kearney, 1965 to 1977, never heard of him. Would pick up young male hitchhikers or young men from gay bars near Redondo Beach, California, excuse me, and kill them, sentenced to imprisonment for life. 21 victims. Now, why is he not better known? Ronald Dominique, United States, 1997 to 2006, 23 victims. Louisianian serial killer, known locally as a Bayou Strangler, and murdered victims in the Terrebonne Parish, the First Parish, Iberville Parish, and Jefferson Parish, sentenced to 8 life terms. One theory on his crimes were that they occurred in rural areas, and there just wasn't that much interest. But if you look at American serial killers, Dahmer's quite far down the list. So it's just interesting. So why is it some get more attention than others? Why do you think? I mean, it could be how these cases are covered. It could be, um, unfortunately, there could also be something to do with victims. This is something that is a little bit taboo. But if you have a killer who kills young women, you can guarantee that killer is going to get a lot of attention. Unfortunately, gay men, and this is perhaps a sad indictment of prejudice. This was certainly true in the Dennis Nelson case, although Nelson is well documented now. At the time, there just wasn't that much public concern, and the police were accused of not really putting that many resources into it. Nelson was a former police officer, and he was a very manipulative character. But one theory was that there was homophobia, and people kind of frankly didn't care about the victims. They thought, well, they're leading, it's just their lifestyle. One of the most tragic things in the Dahmer case, and people who have looked at the case will know about this, one of his youngest victims, a young Laotian boy, actually almost was saved. Dahmer had drilled into his head. I mean, this is disgusting. He drilled into his head. This young boy had actually escaped. He staggered out. And some young women actually saw him, and this was featured in the series I'm watching, and they knew something was off. He was naked. He was clearly underage. They knew something was off here, but disgracefully, the Milwaukee Police Department let it slip under the fingers. They basically believed Dahmer's lies. He basically said he was his boyfriend, and they basically said, "Oh, we don't want anything to do with that. Just keep it in the bedroom." Literally, that was their attitude. Now, disgracefully, the officers in charge of that, instead of being sacked for negligence or even charged with negligence, one of them is now, or at least until recently, was promoted to the Milwaukee. He was president of the Milwaukee Police Union. Talk about corruption. I mean, that must be a slap in the face to the victims. This young Laotian victim, his brother had actually been molested by Dahmer and escaped, and Dahmer had served some time for it. But the fact is, he managed to talk his way out of this, despite these women pleading with the police to look into it. They were basically told to shut up. Drama actually um, is a bit polite in terms of how the police handled that. The reality was the real the real situation is they were even more incompetent and even more dismissive of what had happened. He could have. maybe the injuries were fatal, but it at least may have meant that his crimes were uncovered there and then. Um, but it's just tragic. He was basically sent back to his killer. Tragic. Um, so that brings me to the other part, the other aspect I want to talk about, and I'm at 20 minutes now, so I'm going to round this up quite soon. Um, where do we draw a line between exploitation, um, journalistic interest, public interest? You know, there's a sort of difficult dividing line here because when you have high profile cases that are in the public domain, it's pretty much impossible to prevent people discussing them, uploading videos about them. Indeed, I'm doing it right now. Um, but you know, where is the line drawn between what's in bad taste and what's disrespectful to the victims versus what is out there for genuine academic interest? Now, I saw an SNL skit last night, which was on the Dahmer case. Now, to me, bringing comedy into real life crime is just it should be a no-go area. To me, that's something that is crossing a line because it's not a fictionalized killer. We're talking about actual killers. We're talking about people who had real victims, real human beings. To me, I don't see the funny side of that. I just think that is crossing a line because using the pain of victims to kind of have a punchline, to me, that's disgusting and it's cruel. And there's no merit in that. Now, in the United States, where freedom of speech and freedom of expression is part of the Constitution, you could pretty much do anything and say, oh, well, it's freedom of speech. Um, and unfortunately, with that, sometimes what gets lost is a sense of basic human decency. So I don't think that that SNL sketch that I saw last night had any sort of public interest. I think it was just in bad taste. I don't think it was even particularly witty. What they had was two parole officers going to see Dahmer in prison, and then he started chewing his own fingers to prove that he was insane. But the idea was that he'd eaten some of his victims, and oh yeah, let's make a joke about his cannibalism. And some people might say it's witty. I don't think it even was that witty. I think it was just in bad taste. Another example of this quote. Again, this is from Wikipedia. As from the Herb Baumeister case again. I'd never heard of this guy until last night. Let's see, media coverage. And there's relatively little compared to the Dahmer case. But there's a few things, there's a few documentaries. This is something that caught my attention. Georgia Hardstark covered the case on the podcast My Favorite Murder in episode 67 live at the Egyptian Room during a live performance in Indianapolis and is included on the list of My Favorite Murder episodes. My Favorite Murder? So I checked this out. My Favorite Murder is a weekly true crime comedy. True crime comedy? I don't know how you could put these two things in the same sentence. Podcast hosted by American comedians Karen Gilgariff and Georgia Hardstark. The first episode was released in January 2016. You see, here's the problem I have with this. What they're dealing with, if it's true crime, they're not kind of making a dark comedy about fictional serial killers. They're making comedy, they're making punchlines about actual killers, about actual crime. Um, and I think that's just very disrespectful to the victims, which includes the relatives of the victims. To me, that's crossing a line. That is just like taking something from the point of interest, from the point of, well, it's in the public domain, and taking it to another level of just bad taste, basically. I have a problem with that. I don't have any respect for that. And, people will say, oh, if you don't like it, don't watch it. Well, I won't. But that's not the point. People are entitled to their opinion, and it's entirely subjective. In my opinion, it's bad taste, and I do think it's disrespectful to the victims. Now, I know that some of the victims of Dahmer have spoken out about this latest dramatization. The director has said he's going to be sensitive about how it's done. Well, actually, there's yet another Netflix production on Dahmer, which is a documentary series. Um, I'm not sure actually if it was the director of that. But the point is, there is just an extensive amount out there. And, as a journalist, I'm interested in true crime. I'm interested in, I should say, as someone who's trained as a journalist, I haven't really started my career yet, but I do understand the argument about if these things are in the public domain, there is a legitimate area to look at them and discuss them. Um, but I think it always has to be done in a tasteful way. I've come across true crime channels where the people are talking about the cases in a sensitive way, and they'll even include things like phone numbers. If, for example, it's an ongoing case, they'll include phone numbers, which is contacts for the police, so that people can actually be useful if they know something about the case. It can give leads. Um, I saw one video earlier which was actually a tribute to Dahmer's victims. This is the thing that must never be forgotten: the victims. When Peter Sutcliffe died 2 years ago in this country, to their credit, even the tabloids, instead of talking about Sutcliffe, they had covers on the victims, on the 13 women he killed. This is the thing that's often ignored in these cases, whether it be Dahmer or Bundy or any of the others. Incidentally, sometimes there's misconceptions. Charles Manson's not a serial killer. He's a cult leader who was responsible for murders, but that doesn't make him a serial killer. Ed Gein's not a serial killer. He was a necrophile who may have been responsible for one or two murders. So it's important to understand. Also, there's a difference between a serial killer and a spree killer. So what happened in Thailand the other day, that awful incident in the nursery, that guy was a spree killer. Very evil act. I mean, what possesses someone to do that? But that's a spree killing because it's killing a lot of people in one place at one time. A serial killer could be doing it over years. That's the difference. So it's important that people understand the terminology. But I just think that if people are going to talk about this stuff, if there's going to be documentaries, if there's going to be films, okay, but it should be done in as sensitive a way as possible without, exonerating what happened. I mean, what I've watched so far, this dramatization, it's fairly graphic. I mean, they're showing the murders. And it's quite grisly and it's quite, I wouldn't say that it is overly sensationalist. I mean, the acting's very good. It doesn't look like a cheap production. It looks like there's been a lot of work put into it. It looks like they've done the research. So the question is it exploitative? Is it in bad taste? Or is it legitimate? Probably all three, in all honesty. I mean, you could argue anything that talks about true crime is exploitative in some way, but where do you draw a line with this? Because if you really, really want to say there should be no coverage whatsoever, then newspapers couldn't even report these things. So I think we need to be careful not to get into an area where it's totally swept under the carpet, because there is a legitimate case to be made in part for, for certainly the police should have a vested interest in preventing these things happening in the future. And I think where there is police corruption, as is in the case of Milwaukee, lessons need to be learned as well. Um, but I really think it's important to do it in a sensitive way out of respect for the victims. So I've come across podcasts where they always put the focus on the victims and the lives of the victims. Um, it shouldn't be forgotten these are men, women, boys, and girls who had, loves, interests, ambitions, aspirations, jobs. They had lives, and they were all individuals. And so I think sometimes when the focus is put on the killer, it kind of just desensitizes what's happened and it dehumanizes the victims. It makes them just numbers, statistics. They're people. And that should never be forgotten. Um, so particularly in the United States where there's enormous interest in these people, I think it's impossible to stop that, especially with freedom of speech, protected under the Constitution. Unfortunately, if someone wants to cover this stuff, if it's in bad taste, if one of the victims was to sue them and say this is causing emotional distress, unfortunately, they'd probably lose the case. I personally think if someone is going out of their way just to be vulgar, just to be, you know, I personally would take the side of the victim's family. I really would. But I understand that it's difficult to win a case like that because they'll just say, "Oh, it's my free speech," which I think is a pretty manipulative argument because I think they know that they're just exploiting that in a way that isn't respectful, that isn't done in a sensitive way. Um, in conclusion, I think it's impossible. I think there will always be public interest in stuff. And the particular cases I mentioned are high profile, most of them, but there will be many, many others out there. Particularly in the United States right now, you can guarantee there's going to be serial killers doing what they're doing around the world, and it's sinister. The other thing, of course, to remember is statistically we're very safe. The chances of actually this happening is extremely low. More often than not, serial killers are cards. They target vulnerable people, they target children, they target homeless people, they target women. Um, they're cards ultimately. I don't mean that they're not brazen, and I don't mean that they're not confident. More often than not, they're very arrogant. They think they can outsmart the police, and often they do. But they're cards in the sense of, rarely will you get serial killers taking on full-grown men who can't, you know, who can fight back. Uh, where they do target men, it tends to be vulnerable men, vulnerable in the sense that they're homeless, so they're desperate and they might do things for money, or perhaps they've been drugged and therefore they're incapacitated. The interesting thing is a lot of Dahmer's victims were physically strong young men who probably could have fought back, but Dahmer drugged them. That's what made them vulnerable. Um, so yeah, I mean, there's some real evil out there, but people should kind of have a healthy balance with this stuff. I think it's important not to get too obsessed by it and not to look at this stuff too much, because that can lead you down dark paths. As a journalist, I'm interested, and I think that's fine. I think it's natural. Well, it's common. There is a human interest in this sort of behavior. I mean, perhaps it's hypocritical, a bit like this interest I mentioned in mob films. The law-abiding members of the public, seemingly normal people, we say, "Oh, it's awful, it's terrible," yet there is this fixation and there's this interest. So there's clearly a paradox there. Where we say, "Oh, these monsters should be put away, they're evil, they should get the death penalty," or whatever it is, and yet people have a fascination with this stuff. But I'll just say in closing, ultimately, it is the victims that need to be considered. There is going to be interest in serial killers, in their psychology, in what they do, why they do it, and so on. But there has to be a consideration of the victims as well, their lives and their relatives, their living relatives, because those people. And I watched a documentary on the murders recently, and it was awful. It was heartbreaking watching what the mothers were going through. You could see that they had physically aged from the stress and the mental pressure that they were under. It was tragic to see. Anyway, I'll round this up. But if you do have Netflix, it's like I say, it's well acted. Is it sensationalized? Hard to say. They don't gloss over the details, yet it doesn't look like a cheap thing. It doesn't look like it's done in a sort of crude way. It looks like it's well researched. It looks like they're taking the subject matter seriously and they're not just doing it as a cheap form of exploitation. Um, but I think even if you have a low budget, you could do it in a sensitive way. And I think that comedy thing I mentioned, that to me, that's just in bad taste. because that's an insult to her Baumeister's victims and their families. So these comedians, I don't know what they had in mind, but to me, I just don't think comedy and true crime should go hand in hand. That's call me old fashioned, but to me, it's bad taste.